Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Story. Before tonight's gentle tale begins, take a quiet moment to settle in wherever you are. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. It's always soothing to see our little nighttime community around the world. Now, let your breathing slow. Release the day, soften your thoughts, and simply listen. There's nothing you need to do. Just relax, get comfortable, and allow this calm story to guide you gently, peacefully, towards sleep. The Three Heads of the Well. England fairy tale. Two princesses rested beside the enchanted well. Why were their destinies so different? Long before the days of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, there reigned in the eastern part of England a king who kept his court at Colchester. He was wise, strong, and valiant, by which means he subdued his enemies abroad and secured peace among his subjects at home. In the midst of his glory, his wife died, leaving behind her an only daughter, a gentle, modest, and beautiful maiden about 15 years of age. Very soon the king heard of a lady who also had an only daughter, and he made up his mind to marry her because of her great wealth, though she was bad-tempered and spiteful. Her daughter was full of envy and ill nature too. In short, she was much of the same mold as her mother. In a few weeks, the king, attended by the nobility and gentry, brought his intended bride to his palace, where the marriage rites were performed. The new queen and her daughter had not been long at the court before they set the king against his own beautiful daughter by spreading false reports and accusations. The young princess, having lost her father's love, grew weary of the court. Meeting her father in the garden one day, she entreated him, with tears in her eyes, to allow her to go out into the world to seek her fortune. The king was filled with shame for his neglect of his daughter, but he consented to let her go, and ordered her stepmother to provide her with supplies for her journey. The princess went to the queen, who grudgingly gave her a canvas bag holding brown bread and hard cheese, with a bottle of water. The maiden took this pitiful dowry, returned thanks, and proceeded on her journey, passing through groves, woods, and valleys, till at length she saw an old man sitting on a stone at the mouth of a cave. "Fair maiden, whither away so fast?" asked the old man. "Good father," she replied, "I am going to seek my fortune." "What do you have in your bag and bottle?" "In my bag I have bread and cheese, and in my bottle good fresh water. Would it please you to have some?" "Yes," said he, "with all my heart." With that, the maiden pulled out her provisions and bade the old man eat and welcome. He did so, and gave her many thanks. Then he went on to say, "There is a thick, thorny hedge before you, which will appear impassable. But take this wand in your hand, strike 3 times, and say, 'Pray, hedge, let me come through,' and it will open immediately. Then, a little further, you will find a well. Sit down on the brink of it, and there will come up 3 golden heads, which will speak to you. Pray do whatever they require." Promising she would follow his directions, the princess took her leave of the old man. When she arrived at the hedge, she struck it 3 times and repeated the required words. The hedge divided and gave her a passage. Soon afterward, she reached the well. She had no sooner sat down than a golden head came up singing, "Wash me and comb me and lay me down softly and lay me on a bank to dry, that I may look pretty when somebody comes by." "Yes," said the princess. Stretching forth her hand, she took up the head and combed the hair with a silver comb. She then placed the head carefully on a primrose bank. Up came a second head and a third head, each making the same request. When all 3 had been combed and placed on the bank, the princess pulled out her provisions and ate her dinner. Then said the 3 heads, one to another, "What shall we do for this lady who has used us so kindly?" The first said, "I will cause her beauty to increase so as to charm the most powerful prince in the world." The second said, "I will endow her with such grace of disposition that all who see her will marvel." The third said, "My gift shall not be the least, as she is a king's daughter. I'll make her so fortunate that she shall become queen to the greatest prince that reigns." The heads requested the princess to let them down into the well again. She did so, and continued on her journey. She had not traveled long before she saw a king hunting in the park with his nobles. She would have avoided him, but the king caught sight of her. He approached, and what with her beauty and grace, was so powerfully attracted to her that he commenced his courtship immediately. The princess soon returned his love, and they were married. When the king found that his bride was the King of Colchester's daughter, he ordered some chariots to be made ready, that he might pay a visit to the court at Colchester. The King of Colchester was astonished at his daughter's good fortune, until the young king told him everything that had happened. Great was the joy amongst all at the court of Colchester, with the exception of the queen and her daughter, who were ready to burst with malice and anger that the princess was now above them all. The rejoicings, with feasting and dancing, continued for many days. Then, at length, the young king and his bride returned home, with the dowry her father gave her. The stepsister, seeing that the gentle princess had been so fortunate, told her mother that she too wanted to set out on a journey. The mother furnished her daughter with rich apparel and with quantities of delicious food, and also gave her a large bottle of Malaga wine. The girl started off along the same road that her stepsister had followed. When she approached the cave, the old man was sitting in front of it. He called out, "Young woman, whither so fast?" "What is that to you?" she snapped. "Then," said he, "what have you in your bag and bottle?" She answered, "Good things, which you shall not be troubled with." "Won't you give me some?" he begged. "No, not a bit, nor a drop, unless it would choke you." The old man frowned and said, "Evil fortune will attend you." Going on, the stepsister came to the hedge. She noticed a gap in it, through which she tried to pass. But the hedge closed around her, and the thorns ran into her flesh, so that it was only with great difficulty that she was able to force her way through to the other side. She was now in a painful condition and began to search for water to wash herself. While looking around, she saw the well and sat down on the brink of it. One of the heads came up, singing as before, "Wash me and comb me, and lay me down softly." The stepsister banged the head with her bottle, saying, "Take that for your washing." The second and third heads came up and met with no better treatment than the first, whereupon the three heads consulted among themselves as to what evils they would plague this stranger with for such rough usage. The first head said, "Let her face become ugly and repulsive." The second said, "Let her evil disposition become apparent to all, so that most men will flee from her in loathing." The third head decided that she should have a husband be stowed on her, a poor country cobbler. The miserable girl continued on her way until she came to a town, where it was market day. The people looked at her, and seeing such a loathsome face, and sensing her wickedness, they fled out of her sight, all but a poor cobbler. Not long before, this cobbler had mended the shoes of an old hermit. The hermit had no money to pay for the work, so gave him instead a box of ointment to restore a person's spoiled fiatures. The cobbler was a wise man who could see into the souls of men and women. He understood what had happened to the girl. He went up to her and asked her who she was. "I am," said she, "the King of Colchester's stepdaughter." "Well," said the cobbler, "if I restore you to your natural features, will you for a reward take me as your husband?" "Yes, friend," she replied, "with all my heart." With this, the cobbler applied the ointment, and it worked its effect in a few weeks. At the same time, the cobbler explained gently to the girl that she would have to overcome her selfishness and ill nature, so that her wickedness would no longer strike people with horror. Then the two were married, and they set out for the court at Colchester. When the queen saw that her daughter had married a poor cobbler, she dropped dead of rage. The king felt no sorrow for the death of his wife, for he had only married her for her fortune. He gave the cobbler £100 to take the dog tear to a remote part of the kingdom. There the two lived in harmony for many years, he mending shoes, while his wife assisted the housekeeping by spinning and selling the results of her labors at the country market. The castle in the Silver Wood, Denmark. The soldier found the shimmering forest he had been dreaming of for so long, and with it he found danger and romance. There was once a soldier who spent his time dreaming about a forest where all the trees were silver. On the long marches, when he almost dropped from weariness, he thought about the shining wood and forgot that he was tired. Sometimes his comrades met in a tavern and sang and clinked their glasses. But he thought to himself, a forest of high trees of gleaming silver would please me more than this noisy tavern. When his service in the army had come to an end, the soldier said to himself, now I am free to search over the whole world for the silver wood. And he set off in fine spirits. He traveled a long way and finally came to a house. At the door, a beautiful witch was standing. No one could guess that she was a witch, for her face was smooth and fair, and her hair fell in long golden braids almost to the belt of her soft woolen frock. Can you tell me where I can find the silver wood? The soldier asked her. The witch shook her head. No, my son, I cannot tell you that. To find the wood, one must travel a long way, and a tiring one. Won't you rest here instead and listen to my music? And as she spoke, music, like the song of many birds, sounded around them. But the soldier would not forget his dream of the wood. I cannot tarry, he said. Then follow this road over mountain and valley until you meet my older sister, said the witch. She can tell you the way you shall go. But first, you must promise that you will bring me back a branch from one of the silver trees when you have found them. That I will promise you, said the soldier as he went on his way. The road ran over high hills and through deep valleys, and at last it wound past a house before which a witch stood waiting. She was not beautiful like her sister. Her face was lined, and matted dark hair hung down over her blazing eyes. Can you tell me where I can find the silver wood? Asked the soldier as she came to meet him. No, my son, I cannot tell you, the witch answered. It is still far from here, and I can see that you are footsore and hungry. Stop and rest a while. There is no music here, not even the sound of running water. But one can rest well. Jay must not wait or tarry, said the soldier. Then follow this road until you meet a sister still older than I am. She can tell you where the wood lies. But first, you must promise to bring me back a branch from a silver tree. Greater than, said the soldier. He started on his "that I will promise" way a little slowly now, for the path was rough, and the stones would roll and slip under his feet. After he had gone a long distance, he saw a witch coming down the road toward him. She was old and bent, but she hopped along nimbly and stared at the young man with fiery eyes. The soldier trembled so that he could scarcely speak as he asked her the way to the silver wood. "Are you sure that there is such a wood?" the witch asked in a terrible voice. And for the first time, the soldier began to doubt. "What is the use of going on?" asked the terrible voice. "I will go on until I find the wood," said the soldier. But it took all his courage to do it. Then the witch stepped aside and made way for him. "Follow this road," she said. "Take no turning to left or right, but first promise to come back to me with a silver branch." "That I promise you," said the soldier, and he trudged on. But now he went slowly, for his strength was almost gone. Night was falling, and he found his way by the faint light of moonbeams. Suddenly, the soldier saw that the trees around him were throwing back the moon's beams and gleaming with a light of their own. All of the trunks and branches and leaves were shining silver. Before him, in the middle of the wood, was a castle with high, pointed towers. There were no guards at the gates, and no signs of life in the gardens. And as the soldier drew nearer, he saw a family of pigs standing at the castle doorway, a great one, and 12 small pigs, all staring up at him. Then the old pig spoke. "How have you managed to find your way here? We have been so long without visitors that I had quite given up hope that anyone would come." "I had never thought that a pig could speak," cried the soldier. "I have not always been as you see me," replied the old pig. "My 12 daughters and I were in a very different walk of life before we had the misfortune to be changed into this ugly shape." Then one little pig came forward and said to her father, "We are forgetting that our guest has come a long way. Surely we should offer him food and rest." "Come and share what we have," said the old pig, leading the way into the castle. The supper was not a very good one, but soldiers are not accustomed to soft living, and the long journey had given him an appetite. After they had all eaten, they rested for the night. The next day, the soldier went for a walk with the old pig. All about the castle stretched the silver wood, as lovely as it had been in his dream. The whole forest was shining in the sun, light, and the soldier broke off 3 stout branches, for he had not forgotten the promises he had made. "Will you grant a favor to my daughters and me?" asked the old pig. "You have showed me only kindness, and I would gladly repay it," said the soldier. "Then carry the 3 silver branches to the witches, as you have promised," said the old pig. "But strike them down with the branches. Do not spare them, for only when the witches have been beaten until they have no power will we be freed." It was by these 3 witches that we were turned into pigs. "T will do my best to set you free," said the soldier, and he bade all the pigs goodbye and set off with the silver branches over his shoulder. When he had come to the first witch's house, he pounded on the door and cried, "Come out. I have the silver branch for you." And when the witch reached greedily for it, he brought down the branch upon her head with all his might, and did not leave off beating her until the witch was quite dead. Then he hurried on, and served the second witch the same way. When he came to the house of the youngest and most beautiful of the witches, he had to shut his eyes before he could strike her with the silver bough. But when the silver branch touched her, she became ugly and terrible like her sisters, and he quickly put her to death. Then the soldier turned his steps again to the silver wood, and the way seemed much shorter than it did on the first journey. At the entrance of the wood, he saw an old king standing, with 12 lovely young princesses at his side. They all welcomed the soldier with thanks. "Half of my kingdom seems too small a reward to give you," said the king. "You shall also have my youngest daughter for your wife." And when the soldier looked at the princess, he said, "I know now why I always dreamed of this place, and would not be content until I found it." The 12 Wild Ducks, Norway. This tale of a sister's self-sacrifice is told in Norway. It will remind you of famous stories that are favorites in other lands. Once upon a time, there was a queen who had 12 sons, but no daughter. One day, she was out driving in the woods and met the prettiest little lassie one ever did see. And so the queen stopped her horses, lifted the child up in her arms, kissed her on both cheeks, all the while thinking, "To wish I had a little girl of my own. Oh, how long I've waited and wished for one." Just then, an old witch of the trolls came up to her, but you wouldn't have known it was a witch at all. She looked so kind and good. "A daughter you shall have," she said, "and she shall be the prettiest child in 12 kingdoms, if you will give me whatever comes to meet you at the bridge." Now the queen had a little snow-white dog, of which she was very fond, and it always ran to meet her when she had been away. She thought, of course, it was the dog the old dame wanted. So the queen said, "Yes, you may have what comes to meet me on the bridge." With that, she hurried home as fast as she could. But who should come to meet her on the bridge but her 12 sons? And before the mother could cry out to them, the wicked witch threw her spell upon them and turned them into 12 ducks, which flapped their wings and flew away. Away they went, and away they stayed. But the queen had a daughter, and she was the loveliest child one ever set eyes upon. The princess grew up, and she was both tall and fair, but she was often quiet and sorrowful, and no one could understand what it was that ailed her. The queen, too, was often sorrowful, as you may believe, for she had many strange fears when she thought of her sons. And one day, she said to her daughter, "Why are you so sorrowful, my daughter? Is there anything you want? If so, only say the word, and you shall have it." "Oh, it seems so dull and lonely here," Greater Than said the daughter. "Everyone else has brothers and sisters, but I am all alone. I have none. That's why I'm so sorrowful." "But you had brothers," said the queen. "I had 12 sons, stout, brave lads, but I lost them all when you came." So she told her daughter the whole story. When the princess heard that, she had no rest, for she thought it was all her fault. And, in spite of all the queen could say or do, though she wept and prayed, the lassie would set off to seek her brothers. On and on she walked into the wide world. So far, you would never have thought her small feet could have had strength to carry her so far. Finally, one day, when she was walking through a great, great wood, she felt tired and sat down on a mossy tuft and fell asleep. Then she dreamed that she went deeper and deeper into the wood, till she came to a little wooden hut, and there she found her brothers. Just then she awoke, and straight before her she saw a worn path in the green moss. This path went deeper into the wood, so she followed it and came to just such a little wooden house as that she had seen in her dream. Now, when she went into the room inside, there was no one at home, but there were 12 beds and 12 chairs and 12 spoons. In short, a dozen of everything. When she saw that, she was very glad. She had not been so glad for many a long year, for she could guess at once that her brothers lived there, and that they owned the beds and chairs and spoons. So she began to build up the fire and sweep the room and make the beds and cook the dinner and to tidy the house. When she had done all the work, and the dinner was on the table, she suddenly heard something flapping and whirling in the air, and she slipped behind the door. Then 12 ducks came in. But as soon as ever they crossed the threshold, they became princes. "Oh, how nice and warm it is here," they said. "Heaven bless him who made up the fire and cooked such a nice dinner for us." "But who can it be?" said the youngest prince, and they all hunted both high and low until they found the lassie behind the door. She threw her arms around their necks and said, "I'm your sister. I've gone about seeking you these 3 years, and if I could set you free, I'd willingly give my life." Then all the brothers looked sorrowfully, one at the other, and they shook their heads. "No, it's too hard," said the eldest prince, looking at the pretty young princess. "It's too hard." And again they sighed and shook their heads. "Oh, tell me. Only tell me," said the princess. "How can it be done? And I'll do it, whatever it be." And as she begged and pleaded for them to tell her, the youngest brother said at last, "You must pick thistledown, and you must card it, and spin it, and weave it. After you have done that, you must cut out and make 12 shirts, one for each of us. And while you do that, you must neither talk, nor laugh, nor weep. If you can do that, we are free." "But where shall I ever get thistledown enough for so many shirts?" asked the sister. "Well, that is the hardest thing of all," said the eldest brother. "You must go to the witch's moor at midnight and gather it there." Big tears stood in his eyes. "And you must go alone, all alone." But the sister smiled and nodded her head, and when midnight came and the moon was high in the sky, she said goodbye to her brothers and went to the great wide moor where the witches lived. There stood a great crop of thistles, all nodding and nodding in the breeze, while the down floated and glistened like gossamer through the air in the moonbeams. The princess began to pluck and gather it as fast as she could, but she saw long, skinny arms outstretched toward her, and among the thistles she saw a host of wicked faces all looking at her. Her heart stood still then, and she grew icy cold, but never a sound did she utter, only plucked and gathered until her bag was full. And when she got home at break of day, she set to work carding and spinning yarn from the down. So she went on a long, long time picking down on the witch's moor, carding and spinning, and all the while keeping house for the princes. But she never talked, nor laughed, nor wept. At evening time, home the brothers came, flapping and whirring like wild ducks, and all night they were princes. But in the morning off they flew again, and were wild ducks the whole day. But it happened one night, when the princess was out on the moor, picking thistledown, that the young king who ruled that land was out hunting and had lost his way. He had become separated from his companions, and now, as he came riding across the moor, he saw her. He stopped and wondered who the lovely lady could be that walked alone on the moor, picking thistledown in the dead of the night. And he asked her name. Getting no answer, he was still more astonished, but he liked her so much that at last nothing would do, but he must take her home to his castle and marry her. So he took her and put her upon his horse. The princess wrung her hands and made signs to him, and pointed to the bags in which her work was. And when the king saw she wished to have them with her, he took the bags and placed them behind them. When that was done, the princess, little by little, came to her self. For the king was both a wise man and a handsome man, and he was as gentle and kind to her as a mother. But when they reached the palace, an old woman met them. She was the king's guardian, and when she set eyes on the princess, she became so cross and jealous of her, because she was so lovely, that she said to the king, "Can't you see now that this thing whom you have picked up and whom you are going to marry is a witch? Why, she can neither talk, nor laugh, nor weep." But the king did not care a straw for what she said. He held to the wedding and married the princess, and they lived in great joy and glory. But the princess didn't forget to go on working on her shirts, and she neither talked, nor laughed, nor wept. However, when she had spun and woven and cut, she found that she still had not enough cloth for the 12 shirts, and she must go to the witch's moor again. So that night, while all the palace slept, she quietly slipped out and walked off to pick her thistledown. But the old woman, who was the king's guardian, saw her, and she knew well where the young queen was going. For I must tell you, she was the same wicked witch who had changed the 12 princes into wild ducks. She hurried to the king's chamber, woke him, and said, "Now come with me, and I'll prove to you that your lovely queen is a witch, who joins the wicked company on the moor at midnight." The king would not listen to her at first, but when he saw that the queen's bed was empty, he got up and went with the old woman. Upon the edge of the moor, they stopped, but in the clear moonlight, they could see the queen among the horrid hags and trolls. The king turned away sadly and said not a word, for he loved his quiet queen very much. But the wicked old woman began to whisper and tell abroad about the queen's nightly visit to the moor, and at last the king's best men came to him and said, We will not have a queen who is a witch. The people demand of you that she be burned alive." Then the king was so sad that there was no end to his sadness, for now he saw that he could not save his queen. He was obliged to order her to be burned alive on a pile of wood. When the pile was all ablaze, and the men were about to put her on it, she made signs to them to take 12 boards and lay them around the pile. On these, she placed the shirts for her brothers, all completed, but that for the youngest, which lacked its left sleeve. She had not had time to finish it. As soon as ever she had done that, the people heard a flapping and whirring in the air, and down came 12 wild ducks from over the forest. Each snapped up his shirt in his bill and flew off with it. "See, now," said the old woman to the king. "Wasn't I right when I told you she was a witch? Make haste and burn her before the pile burns low." "Oh," said the king, "we've wood enough to spare, and so ill wait a bit, for I have a mind to see what the end of this will be." As he spoke, up came the 12 princes, riding along, as handsome, well-grown lads as you'd wish to see. But the youngest prince had a wild duck's wing instead of his left arm. "What's all this about?" asked the princes. "My queen is to be burned," said the king, "because she is a witch, so the people say, and I can't save her." "Speak now, sister," said the princes. "You have set us free and saved us. Now save yourself." Then the young queen spoke and told the whole story, and the king and all the people listened with wonder and joy. Only the wicked old woman stood trembling with fear, and when the queen had finished her story, the people took the old witch and destroyed her. The king took his wife and the 12 princes and went home with them to their father and mother, and told all that had befallen them. Then there was joy and gladness over the whole kingdom, because the wicked witch was dead, and the princess was saved and set free, and because the lovely princess, in turn, had set free her 12 brothers. The princesses who lived in a Katlyard, Scotland. Nanny was proud, Bess was sulky, Elspeth was canny. Could one of them outwit the giant on his Scottish moor? Once upon a time, there was a queen of Scotland. When the king, her husband, died, the kingdom passed to a distant cousin, and the queen and her 3 daughters had to go to a cottage in a lonely part of the country. For this cousin of theirs was not nearly so good a king as the queen's husband had been, and he did not want the queen and the 3 princesses near the castle, where they could always see how he was ruling, and could pass comparisons of him and his predecessor. The new king, accordingly, had packed them off to a distant part of the kingdom where they had no neighbors at all to talk to, and only a little field where they could keep their cow, and a patch of ground for their cabbages. But the queen was a good, thrifty woman, and she said to the princesses they must make the best of the little bit of land they had, or their fortunes would never be mended. They all set to work, therefore, to carry stones from the moor and build a stout wall round the Katlyard, so the cow couldn't eat the cabbages. Whenever the eldest princess, whose name was Nanny, began to grumble and talk about the fine castle they once lived in, the queen would say, "Make the best of it when you're getting the worst of it, and soon the worst of it turns to the best it. But that nasty, mean, stingy cousin of ours had no right to turn us out this way," cried Nanny, who was a proud little lass, and did not mind the hard times so much as the injustice. "Fortune mends when grumbling ends," said the queen. And that was all Nanny could get out of her. One morning, when Bess, the second princess, ran out to pull a cabbage, she came tearing back, white as paint, and shouted out before she got inside the cottage, and you can tell how serious a thing had happened to make her so forget her manners, for princesses never speak except in the gentlest, sweetest voices. "Oh, mother, do come and look at the Katlyard. Someone's been there in the night and cut off a whole row of cabbages and taken them away with him." Well, now there was a to-do and a scuttering to the Katlyard, but at the end of it, the queen hushed the little princesses, who were stamping their feet and carrying on something terrible at the thought of their few cabbages being taken from them. Now, children," said she, "fortune mends when grumbling ends. The stalks are left, and if we wait a while, there's sure to be the sweetest baby cabbages, a dozen on each, maybe. You know how fond you are of those." "But it's the injustice of it," cried Nanny. "Nobody has any right to steal our cabbages when we have made a wall and kept them from the cow and dug the soil and watered them." "I won't dig there any more," said Bess, who had a fine Scotch temper, and sulked and pouted where Nanny stamped her foot. "You will notice you haven't heard about the third princess yet. Well, her name was Elspeth, and the reason you haven't heard of her is that she never was much for talking, but just went about her business smiling away and doing everything so cannily it was a pleasure to watch her. She had stayed behind at the Katlyard, and now she came dancing along the path. "Oh, mother," said she, "there are such big boot marks along by the wall in the mud." Well, now they must all run and look. And sure enough, there were the most enormous boot marks, so big that the queen said at once, "Why, a giant must have been here." You might think Nanny and Bess and Elspeth would have been afraid to hear that. But being princesses, they had been brought up never to be afraid of anything. And Nanny said she should take her milking stool and wrap herself in her mother's plaid and sit up all the next night in the Katlyard, so that if the giant came again, she could send him about his business. So that night, when the others went to bed, Nanny marched out with her milking stool and set herself down to watch. The moon was up, and the cabbages glistened as plainly as if it had been day. She drew her plaid round her and hid every bit of her face, except the tiniest part of her eyes to peep out of. Then came a dull sort of tramping sound in the stillness, and over the wall she heard a scuffling and hustling. And then there stepped into the Katlyard the biggest sort of a giant. He stooped down and cut off a row of cabbages before Nanny could get her plaid off her mouth. Then she cried out, "What are you doing with our cabbages?" "What business is that of yours?" said the giant, so impolitely that Nanny raged with anger. Think of the injustice of his stealing their cabbages, and then asking what business it was of hers. "There are cabbages, and you put down that sack and go about your business," cried Nanny, putting on her haughtiest air. Well, what do you think the giant did? If he didn't stoop down and pick up Nanny as if she were a cabbage and toss her into the sack on top of them. Then he put the sack over his broad shoulder and went striding off over the hill and dale. Dear, dear. But she had an uncomfortable journey, and when the giant marched into his house and threw the sack down on the floor, Nanny crawled from the sack so shaken about she hadn't the strength to stamp her foot, even when the giant told her she must drive his cow to pasture, comb, card, and spin a bag of wool, and make a great bicker of porridge for his supper against the time when he returned. It was no use to try to run away, for the giant could reach out his long arm and pick her up as if she were a fly. And so Nanny had to go along behind the cow, with the giant watching her all morning. Then she tethered the cow to a patch of grass and came back to see about the wool and the porridge. When she got inside the door, the giant couldn't see her, and so Nanny thought she would make herself a sup of porridge for her dinner. She found a little iron pot where the giant kept his salt, and in this she boiled a nice little sup of porridge for herself and sat down to eat it. She had just sat down on the floor to have her dinner when there came a knock. It was a timid little knock, and when she called, "Who's that?" a weak, shivery sort of voice said, "'Tis a poor traveler, mistress, lost on the moor and wishful for a bite, if you can spare one. Faith, no, said proud Nanny. I've little for one and less for two. Be off about your business, or the giant will be after you. Well, she heard no more of the traveler, and after she had eaten the porridge, she piled the peat under the great bicker full of meal, and gave it a stir, and then she set to work to comb the wool. But the more she combed, the more knots came into it, and she grew angrier and angrier, until when the giant marched in, there was all the bag of wool spoiled, and the poor ridge burnt as black as the pot. For every knot of wool that wouldn't come out, Nanny had tossed into the fire and sent a great blaze under the bicker. Mercy, but he was angry. He picked up Nanny and took her out into the byre and threw her up into the loft among the hens and told her to say there, for she was no use at all. And didn't Nanny cry and storm at the injustice of it, when she had been driving his cow and trying to comb his wool all day? Well, the next night, Bess said she would sit up and watch, so that she could make the giant give back their sister Nanny. But directly the giant saw her, before she had a chance to speak, he put her in the very bottom of his sack and piled the cabbages upon her until, if there hadn't been a little hole for her to breathe through, she would have been suffocated. Exactly the same things happened to her, even to the poor traveler coming and being turned away. For Bess determined to make things as unpleasant as she could for the giant and everyone, and sulked till her face looked as heavy as an underdone pud. Ding! Dear, dear. But the giant was angry when he got home the next night and found nothing done. He threw her, too, up into the byre with the hens, and there she found Nanny. You can imagine how glad they were to see each other. Nanny forgot her temper, and Bess forgot her sulks, and they kissed and hugged each other. And then they ate a little of the meal that had been thrown to the hens, and went to sleep, cuddled up in their plaids. When the giant went to the Katlyard the third night, there was the third princess, Elspeth, perched on the wall. But when she saw him coming, she called out, "Good evening," most politely. "You're coming along with me," said the giant, in a terribly gruff voice. And Elspeth said, "I expected to, and that is why I am here." Seeing she spoke so politely and smiled in such a pleasant way, the giant had no wish to ill-treat her, and when he had put in the cabbages, he set her on the top of them quite ably. Then off he went with the sack on his shoulder as before. But Elspeth had her little scissors with her, and she cut a wee little hole in the sack, and peeped through, and noticed every bit of the way they went, so that she would know the road home again. When they got to the giant's house, Elspeth had sat so quietly she had been no weight or trouble at all. And when the giant set her down on the floor, without a single bump, she stepped out, as pretty as a picture. Then the giant gave his orders, and she nodded when he said she must drive the cow, and said, yes, she could do that. And when he showed her the bicker full of porridge, she said, yes, she could make good porridge. And when he showed her the bag of wool, she said she never had combed or carded or spun any wool, but she would try her best. Then the giant went off for his snooze in the heather, and Elspeth attended to the cow and came back and made herself a sup of porridge for her dinner. Just as she was going to eat it, however, the timid knock sounded, and the weak, shivery voice of the poor traveler was heard outside the door. Instead of staying where she was and calling out, which is no sort of welcome, as everyone knows, Elspeth set down her little pot and ran to the door. Outside stood the queerest-looking fellow you ever saw. His hair was bright red gold, and it stuck up like a shock of hay on fire, and his thin, white face and bright blue eyes peered out beneath. He was dressed in a kilt of green and silver tartan, and had tossed a plaid over his shoulder, so that he was not so poorly clothed, but it was plain he was hungry, for his face was thin as a hatchet, and he was rubbing his stomach in the most pitiful way. Well, he told he had lost his way on the moor, and seeing the smoke, he had come to the giant's house, and now he begged for a sup of something. All Elspeth had to give him was her own dinner. But she brought that out to him, and when he had finished, he said he would like to do a service for her, and asked if she had any wool she wanted carded. Elspeth was ready enough to say yes, and out she brought the great bag the giant had left, and down sat the poor, strange traveler. And in less than a twinkling, his thin fingers had run through it, and combed it, and carded it, and then he told her to fetch out the spinning wheel, and there he sat and spun the wool till it was as white and fine as dandelion down. When he had finished, he jumped out and vanished, just as quickly as a dandelion ball when you puff it. And that was the last she saw of him. When the giant came in, there was his porridge cooked to perfection, the peat bright and cheerful, the wool finished, and Elspeth ready to wait on him. The giant was so pleased. He told her where her sisters were, and said she could set the ladder against the loft and climb up to them. And if you can teach them to work as well as you have done, I'll let them come down again some day, when their proud hearts are brought low, said the giant. You can guess how glad Elspeth was to find her sisters again. In the morning, when Elspeth ran down to attend to the fire and get the giant's breakfast, she said, "If you please, would you mind carrying a creel of heather to my mother's cottage, as there are none of us left to get bedding for the cow?" Elspeth asked so politely, with such a pretty smile, that the giant could not think of any other answer. But yes, and off he strode with the big basket of heather on his shoulder before he took his daily nap. Elspeth was busy at work all day, and in the evening, the giant again said she might go and sleep with her sisters, and maybe he would let them come down someday, so that Elspeth might teach them to work as well as she did. Well, the next morning, there was another big creel full of grass lying in the yard, and Elspeth again asked the giant if he would carry it over to her mother, as there was no one left to pull fodder for the cow. And again, the giant agreed and took over the basket. He was just as pleased with Elspeth when he came back in the evening, and said next day her two sisters might come down, for he was going on a journey, and would like the house redd up. "In case I am not down when you start," said Elspeth, "would you very kindly carry this last basket of bog myrtle for my mother to stuff a pillow? I will leave it by the door." Well, the giant was going past the Katlyard, and he agreed to take it. Next morning, Elspeth was not down, but there lay the basket. And when he had set it down inside the Katlyard wall and gone about his business, who should creep out but Elspeth? And then didn't she run across the Katlyard and into the cottage, where her mother and Nanny and Bess were setting breakfast. For of course, Nanny and Bess had been hidden in the baskets of grass and heather which the giant had carried so obligingly. Just as they were toasting their bannocks and supping their brose, who should come riding up, but a fine messenger with a gilded coach, to say their cousin, the king, had become much nicer, and had sent for them, so that the queen could help him to rule the kingdom, and they were all to come at once, and live in the castle, which had been their own dear home. And so, when the giant came back that night, and found the three princesses gone, and rushed over to the Katlyard to look for them, there was nothing for him, neither the cow, nor a hen, nor a cabbage. For the queen, with true Scottish thrift, had taken everything away with her. Spindle, shuttle, and needle, Germany, a prince sought far and wide for a bride who should be at once the richest and the poorest in the land. There was once upon a time a little girl whose father and mother died when she was quite young. At the end of the village where she lived, her godmother dwelt in a small cottage, maintaining herself by spinning, weaving, and sewing. And she took the poor child to maintain, teaching her to work and educating her piously. Just when the girl had reached the age of 15, the godmother fell ill, and calling her to her bedside, said to her, "My dear daughter, I feel my end approaching. I leave you this cottage, where you will be protected from wind and weather, and also this spindle, shuttle, and needle, with which you may earn your living." With these words, she laid her hands on the girl's head and blessed her, saying, "So long as you remember God, everything will prosper with you." Soon afterwards, the good godmother closed her eyes in death. And when she was carried to the grave, the poor maiden followed the coffin, weeping bitterly. To pay her the last respect, the little girl now lived alone in her cottage, industriously spinning, weaving, and sewing. And upon everything that she did rested the blessing of God. It seemed as if the flax in her room increased by itself, and when she wove a piece of cloth or tapestry or hemmed a shirt, she always found a purchaser readily, who paid her so handsomely that she had enough for herself and could spare a little for others who were poorer. Now about this time, the son of the king of this country was looking about him for a bride. And as he was not allowed to marry a poor wife, he would not have a rich one. So he said, "She shall be my bride, who is at once the richest and the poorest." When he came to the village where the maiden dwelt, he asked, as was his custom, who was the richest and poorest maiden in the place. The people first named the richest, and then told him that the poorest was the maiden who dwelt in the cottage at the end of the village. The young prince therefore went first to the rich maiden, and found her sitting before her door in full dress. But as soon as she saw him approaching, she got up and made him a very low curtsy. He looked at her once, and then, without speaking a word, rode away to the house of the poor maiden, whom he found not standing at the door, but sitting in her kitchen. He stopped his horse, and, looking through the window into the kitchen, perceived how brightly the sun shone into it, and how industriously the girl herself was engaged at her spinning wheel. She looked up, but as soon as she saw the prince peeping at her, she blushed as red as a rose, and looked down again, industriously turning her wheel round. Whether the thread just then was quite even or not, I know not, but she spun on till the prince rode away. Then she stepped to the window and opened it, saying, "It is so hot in this kitchen." But she remained at the window, looking out, as long as she could see the white feathers upon the prince's hat. After this, she sat down again to her work, and presently a sentence came into her head, which her godmother had often repeated whilst she was working. She sang, "Spindle, spindle, out with you, and bring a wooer home." Scarcely had she spoken the words when the spindle sprang from her hands and out of the door. And as she sprang up and looked after it, she saw it merrily dancing along over the field, leaving a golden thread behind it. In a short time, it was out of sight. And then the maiden, having no other spindle, took the shuttle in her hand and began to weave. Meanwhile, the spindle still danced on, and as the thread came to an end, it reached the king's son. "What do I see?" exclaimed he. "The spindle showing me the way?" And turning his horse's head round, he rode back, guided by the golden thread. At the same time, the girl, sitting at work, sang, "Shuttle, shuttle, out with you, and bring a wooer home." Immediately it sprang out of her hands and through the door, before which it began to weave a carpet more beautiful than was ever before seen. On both borders were represented roses and lilies blooming, and in the middle, on the golden ground, green vine branches, hares, and rabbits, too, were represented, jumping about, and fawns and does rubbing their heads against trees, on whose boughs were sitting pretty birds, who wanted nothing but the gift of song. And all this pattern the shuttle wove so quickly that it seemed to grow by itself. But because the shuttle had run away, the maiden sat down to her sewing, and while she stitched her work, she sang, "Needle, needle, sharp and fine, fit the house for wooer mine." As soon as she had said this, the needle flew out of her fingers and sprang all about the room like a flash of lightning. It seemed as if invisible spirits were at work, for in a few minutes the table and bench were covered with green cloths, the chairs with velvet, and on the walls were hung silken curtains. And scarcely had the needle put the last stitch to them, when the maiden saw through the window the white feathers on the hat of the prince, who was coming toward her cottage, drawn by the golden thread of the spindle. As soon as he approached the door, he dismounted and walked upon the carpet into the cottage. As soon as he entered the room, there stood the maiden in her shabby clothes, glowing like a rose in a bush. "You are the poorest, and yet the richest maiden," said the prince to her. "Come with me, and you shall be my bride." She said nothing, but held out her hand, which the prince took, and giving her a kiss, he led her out of the cottage and seated her behind him on his horse. He took her to the king's castle, where the wedding was performed with great magnificence, and afterwards the spindle, the shuttle, and the needle were placed in the treasure chamber and held in great esteem. Princess Finola and the Dwarf. Ireland. How could a weak and mute dwarf hope to rescue his princess from the enchanted moor? A long, long time ago, there lived in a little hut in the midst of a bare, brown, lonely moor an old woman and a young girl. The old woman was arid, sour-tempered, and dumb. The young girl was as sweet and as fresh as an opening rosebud, and her voice was as musical as the whisper of a stream in the woods in the hot days of summer. The little hut, made of branches woven closely together, was shaped like a beehive. In the center of the hut, a fire burned night and day from year's end to year's end, though it was never touched or tended by human hand. In the cold days and nights of winter, it gave out light and heat that made the hut cozy and warm. But in the summer nights and days, it gave out light only. With their heads to the wall of the hut and their feet toward the fire were two sleeping couches, one of plain woodwork in which slept the old woman. The other was Finola's. It was of bog oak, polished as a looking glass, and on it were carved flowers and birds of all kinds that gleamed and shone in the light of the fire. This couch was fit for a princess, and a princess Finola was, though she did not know it herself. Outside the hut, the bare, brown, lonely moor stretched for miles on every side, but toward the east it was bounded by a range of mountains that looked to Finola blue in the daytime, but which put on 100 changing colors as the sun went down. Nowhere was a house to be seen, nor a tree, nor a flower, nor sign of any living thing. From morning till night, nor hum of bee, nor song of bird, nor voice of man, nor any sound fell on Finola's ear. When the storm was in the air, the great waves thundered on the shore beyond the mountains, and the wind shouted in the glens. But when it sped across the moor, it lost its voice and passed as silently as the dead. At first, the silence frightened Finola, but she got used to it after a time, and often broke it by talking to herself and singing. The only other person, besides the old woman, Finola ever saw was a dumb dwarf who, mounted on a broken-down horse, came once a month to the hut, bringing with him a sack of corn for the old woman and Finola. Although he couldn't speak to her, Finola was always glad to see the dwarf and his old horse, and she used to give them cake made with her own white hands. As for the dwarf, he would have died for the little princess. He was so much in love with her. And often his heart was heavy and sad as he thought of her pining away in the lonely moor. It chanced that he came one day, and she did not, as usual, come out to greet him. He made signs to the old woman, but she took up a stick and struck him, and beat his horse and drove him away. But as he was leaving, he caught a glimpse of Finola at the door of the hut, and saw that she was crying. This sight made him so very miserable that he could think of nothing else but her sad face that he had always seen so bright. And he allowed the old horse to go on without minding where he was going. Suddenly, he heard a voice saying, "It is time for you to come." The dwarf looked, and right before him, at the foot of a green hill, was a little man not half as big as himself, dressed in a green jacket with brass buttons and a red cap and tassel. "T.T., is time for you to come," he said the second time. "But you are welcome anyhow. Get off your horse and come in with me, that I may touch your lips with the wand of speech, that we may have a talk together." The dwarf got off his horse and followed the little man through a hole in the side of a green hill. The hole was so small that he had to go on his hands and knees to pass through it, and when he was able to stand, he was only the same height as the little ferryman. After walking 3 or 4 steps, they were in a splendid room, as bright as day. Diamonds sparkled in the roof, as stars sparkle in the sky when the night is without a cloud. The roof rested on golden pillars, and between the pillars were silver lamps, but their light was dimmed by that of the diamonds. In the middle of the room was a table on which were 2 golden plates and 2 silver knives and forks, and a brass bell as big as a hazelnut. And beside the table were 2 little chairs covered with blue silk and satin. "Take a chair," said the fairy, "and I will ring for the wand of speech." The dwarf sat down, and the ferryman rang the little brass bell, and in came a little weeny dwarf no bigger than your hand. "Bring me the wand of speech," said the fairy, and the weeny dwarf bowed 3 times and walked out backward, and in a minute he returned, carrying a little black wand with a red berry at the top of it, and, giving it to the fairy, he bowed 3 times and walked out backward, as he had done before. The little man waved the wand 3 times over the dwarf, and struck him once on the right shoulder, and once on the left shoulder, and then touched his lips with the red berry, and said, "Speak." The dwarf spoke, and he was so rejoiced at hearing the sound of his own voice that he danced about the room. "Who are you at all?" "At all," said he to the fairy. "Who is yourself?" said the fairy. "But come, before we have any talk, let us have something to eat, for I am sure you are hungry." Then they sat down to table, and the fairy rang the little brass bell twice, and the weeny dwarf brought in 2 boiled snails in their shells. And when they had eaten the snails, he brought in a dormouse. And when they had eaten the dormouse, he brought in 2 wrens. And when they had eaten the wrens, he brought in 2 nuts full of wine. And they became very merry. And the ferryman sang Coolin Das, and the dwarf sang The Little Black Bird of the Glen. "Did you ever hear the foggy dew?" said the fairy. "No," said the dwarf. "Well then, I'll give it to you, but we must have some more wine." And the wine was brought, and he sang the foggy dew, and the dwarf said it was the sweetest song he had ever heard, and that the ferryman's voice would coax the birds off the bushes. "You asked me who I am?" said the fairy. "I did," said the dwarf. "And I asked you, who is yourself?" "You did," said the dwarf. "And who are you, then?" "Well, to tell the truth, I don't know," said the dwarf, and he blushed like a rose. "Well, tell me what you know about yourself." "TJ remember nothing at all," said the dwarf. "Before the day I found myself going along with a crowd of all sorts of people to the great fair of the Liffey. We had to pass by the king's palace on our way, and as we were passing, the king sent for a band of jugglers to come and show their tricks before him. I followed the jugglers to look on, and when the play was over, the king called me to him and asked me who I was and where I came from. I was dumb then and couldn't answer, but even if I could speak, I could not tell him what he wanted to know, for I remembered nothing of myself before that day. Then the king asked the jugglers, but they knew nothing about me, and no one knew anything. And then the king said he would take me into his service, and the only work I have to do is to go once a month with a bag of corn to the hut in the lonely moor. And there you fell in love with the little princess," said the fairy, winking at the dwarf. The poor dwarf blushed twice as much as he had done before. "You need not blush," said the fairy. "It is a good man's case. And now tell me truly, do you love the princess? And what would you give to free her from the spell of enchantment that is over her?" "I would give my life," said the dwarf. "Well then, listen to me," said the fairy. "The Princess Finola was banished to the lonely moor by the king, your master. He killed her father, who was the rightful king, and would have killed Finola. Only he was told by an old sorceress that if he killed her, he would die himself on the same day, and she advised him to banish her to the lonely moor, and she said she would fling a spell of enchantment over it, and that until the spell was broken, Finola could not leave the moor. And the sorceress also promised that she would send an old woman to watch over the princess by night and by day, so that no harm should come to her. But she told the king that he himself should select a messenger to take food to the hut, and that he should look out for someone who had never seen or heard of the princess, and whom he could trust never to tell anyone anything about her. And that is the reason he selected you. Since you know so much, said the dwarf, can you tell me who I am and where I came from? You will know that time enough, said the fairy. I have given you back your speech. It will depend solely on yourself whether you will get back your memory of who and what you were before the day you entered the king's service. But are you really willing to try and break the spell of enchantment and free the princess? "I am," said the dwarf. "Whatever it will cost you." "Yes, if it cost me my life," said the dwarf. "But tell me, how can the spell be broken?" "Oh, it is easy enough to break the spell if you have the weapons," said the fairy. "And what are they? And where are they?" said the dwarf. "The spear of the shining haft, and the dark blue blade, and the silver shield," said the fairy. "They are on the farther bank of the mystic lake, in the island of the western seas. They are there for the man who is bold enough to seek them. If you are the man who will bring them back to the lonely moor, you will only have to strike the shield 3 times with the haft, and 3 times with the blade of the spear, and the silence of the moor will be broken forever. The spell of enchantment will be removed, and the princess will be free." "JT will set out at once," said the dwarf, jumping from his chair. "And whatever it cost you," said the fairy, "will you pay the price?" "JT will," said the dwarf. "Well then, mount your horse, give him his head, and he will take you to the shore opposite the island of the mystic lake. You must cross to the island on his back, and make your way through the water steeds that swim around the island night and day to guard it. But woe betide you if you attempt to cross without paying the price. For if you do, the angry water steeds will rend you and your horse to pieces. And when you come to the mystic lake, you must wait until the waters are as red as wine, and then swim your horse across it. And on the farther side, you will find the spear and shield. But woe betide you if you attempt to cross the lake before you pay the price. For if you do, the black cormorants of the western seas will pick the flesh from your bones." "What is the price?" said the dwarf. "You will know that time enough," said the fairy. "But now go, and good luck go with you." The dwarf thanked the fairy and said goodbye. He then threw the reins on his horse's neck and started up the hill that seemed to grow bigger and bigger as he ascended. And the dwarf soon found that what he took for a hill was a great mountain. After traveling all the day, toiling up by steep crags and heath-airy passes, he reached the top as the sun was setting in the ocean. And he saw far below him, out in the waters, the island of the mystic lake. He began his descent to the shore, but long before he reached it, the sun had set, and darkness, unpierced by a single star, dropped upon the sea. The old horse, worn out by his long and painful journey, sank beneath him, and the dwarf was so tired that he rolled off his back and fell asleep by his side. He awoke at the breaking of the morning and saw that he was almost at the water's edge. He looked out to sea and saw the island, but nowhere could he see the water steeds, and he began to fear he must have taken a wrong course in the night, and that the island before him was not the one he was in search of. But even while he was so thinking, he heard fierce and angry snortings, and coming swiftly from the island to the shore, he saw the swimming and prancing steeds. Sometimes their heads and manes only were visible, and sometimes, rearing, they rose half out of the water, and striking it with their hoofs, churned it into foam, and tossed the white spray to the skies. As they approached nearer and nearer, their snortings became more terrible, and their nostrils shot forth clouds of vapor. The dwarf trembled at the sight and sound, and his old horse, quivering in every limb, moaned piteously, as if in pain. On came the steeds, until they almost touched the shore. Then rearing, they seemed about to spring onto it. The frightened dwarf turned his head to fly, and as he did so, he heard the twang of a golden harp. And right before him, whom should he see but the little man of the hills, holding a harp in one hand and striking the strings with the other. "Are you ready to pay the price?" said he, nodding gaily to the dwarf. As he asked the question, the listening water steeds snorted more furiously than ever. "Are you ready to pay the price?" said the little man a second time. A shower of spray, tossed on shore by the angry steeds, drenched the dwarf to the skin and sent a cold shiver to his bones, and he was so terrified that he could not answer. For the third and last time, "Are you ready to pay the price?" asked the fairy, as he flung the harp behind him and turned to depart. When the dwarf saw him going, he thought of the little princess in the lonely moor, and his courage came back, and he answered bravely, "Yes, I am ready." The water steeds, hearing his answer and snorting with rage, struck the shore with their pounding hoofs. "Back to your waves," cried the little harper, and as he ran his fingers across his lyre, the frightened steeds drew back into the waters. "What is the price?" asked the dwarf. "Your right eye," said the fairy. And before the dwarf could say a word, the fairy scooped out the eye with his finger and put it into his pocket. The dwarf suffered most terrible agony, but he resolved to bear it, for the sake of the little princess. Then the fairy sat down on a rock at the edge of the sea, and after striking a few notes, he began to play the strains of slumber. The sound crept along the waters, and the steeds, so ferocious a moment before, became perfectly still. They had no longer any motion of their own, and they floated on the top of the tide like foam before a breeze. "Now," said the fairy, as he led the dwarf's horse to the edge of the tide. The dwarf urged the horse into the water, and once out of his depth, the old horse struck out boldly for the island. The sleeping water steeds drifted helplessly against him, and in a short time he reached the island safely, and he neighed joyously as his hooves touched solid ground. The dwarf rode on and on until he came to a bridle path, and following this, it led him up through winding lanes bordered with golden firs that filled the air with fragrance, and brought him to the summit of the green hills that girdled and looked down on the mystic lake. Here, the horse stopped of his own accord, and the dwarf's heart beat quickly as his eye rested on the lake that, clipped round by the ring of hills, seemed in the breezeless and sunlit air as still as death and as bright as life can be. After gazing at it for a long time, he dismounted and lay at his ease in the pleasant grass. Hour after hour passed, but no change came over the face of the waters, and when the night fell, sleep closed the eyelids of the dwarf. The song of the lark awoke him in the early morning, and starting up, he looked at the lake, but its waters were as bright as they had been the day before. Toward midday, he beheld what he thought was a black cloud sailing across the sky from east to west. It seemed to grow larger as it came nearer and nearer. And when it was high above the lake, he saw it was a huge bird, the shadow of whose outstretched wings darkened the waters of the lake. And the dwarf knew it was one of the cormorants of the western seas. As it descended slowly, he saw that it held in one of its claws a branch of a tree, larger than a full-grown oak, and laden with clusters of ripe red berries. It alighted at some distance from the dwarf, and after resting for a time, it began to eat the berries and to throw the stones into the lake, and wherever a stone fell, a bright red stain appeared in the water. As he looked more closely at the bird, the dwarf saw that it had all the signs of old age, and he could not help wondering how it was able to carry such a heavy tree. Later in the day, 2 other birds, as large as the first, but younger, came up from the west and settled down beside him. They also ate the berries, and throwing the stones into the lake, it was soon as red as wine. When they had eaten all the berries, the young birds began to pick the decayed feathers off the old bird and to smooth his plumage. As soon as they had completed their task, he rose slowly from the hill and sailed out over the lake, and dropping down on the waters, dived beneath them. In a moment, he came to the surface and shot up into the air with a joyous cry, and flew off to the west in all the vigor of renewed youth, followed by the other birds. When they had gone so far that they were like specks in the sky, the dwarf mounted his horse and descended toward the lake. He was almost at the margin, and in another minute would have plunged in, when he heard a fierce screaming in the air. And before he had time to look up, the 3 birds were hovering over the lake. The dwarf drew back, frightened. The birds wheeled over his head, and then, swooping down, they flew close to the water, covering it with their wings and uttering harsh cries. Then, rising to a great height, they folded their wings and dropped headlong like 3 rocks on the lake, crashing its surface and scattering a wine-red shower upon the hills. Then the dwarf remembered what the fairy told him, that if he attempted to swim the lake without paying the price, the 3 cormorants of the western seas would pick the flesh off his bones. He knew not what to do, and was about to turn away when he heard once more the twang of the golden harp, and the little fairy of the hills stood before him. "Faint heart never won fair lady," said the little harper. "Are you ready to pay the price? The spear and shield are on the opposite bank, and the Princess Finola is crying this moment in the lonely moor." At the mention of Finola's name, the dwarf's heart grew strong. "Yes," he said, "I am ready, win or die. What is the price?" "Your left eye," said the fairy, and as soon as said, he scooped out the eye and put it in his pocket. The poor blind dwarf almost fainted with pain. "It's your last trial," said the fairy. "And now do what I tell you. Twist your horse's mane round your right hand, and I will lead him to the water. Plunge in, and fear not. I gave you back your speech. When you reach the opposite bank, you will get back your memory, and you will know who and what you are." Then the fairy led the horse to the margin of the lake. "In with you now, and good luck go with you," said the fairy. The dwarf urged the horse. He plunged into the lake and went down and down until his feet struck the bottom. Then he began to ascend, and as he came near the surface of the water, the dwarf thought he saw a glimmering light, and when he rose above the water, he saw the bright sun shining and the green hills before him, and he shouted with joy at finding his sight restored. But he saw more. Instead of the old horse he had ridden into the lake, he was bestride a noble steed, and as the steed swam to the bank, the dwarf felt a change coming over himself and an unknown vigor in his limbs. When the steed touched the shore, he galloped up the hillside, and on the top of the hill was a silver shield, bright as the sun, resting against a spear standing upright in the ground. the dwarf jumped off, and running toward the shield, he saw himself as in a looking glass. He was no longer a dwarf, but a gallant knight. At that moment, his memory came back to him, and he knew he was Connell, one of the knights of the Red Branch, and he remembered now that the spell of dumbness and deformity had been cast upon him by the witch of the Palace of the Quicken Trees. Slinging his shield upon his left arm, he plucked the spear from the ground and leaped on to his horse. With a light heart, he swam back over the lake, and nowhere could he see the black cormorants of the western seas, but 3 white swans floating abreast followed him to the bank. When he reached the bank, he galloped down to the sea and crossed to the shore. Then he flung the reins upon his horse's neck, and swifter than the wind, the gallant horse swept on, and it was not long until he was bounding over the enchanted moor. Wherever his hoofs struck the ground, grass and flowers sprang up, and great trees with leafy branches rose on every side. At last the knight reached the little hut. 3 times he struck the shield with the haft, and 3 times with the blade of his spear. At the last blow, the hut disappeared, and standing before him was the little princess. The knight took her in his arms and kissed her. Then he lifted her onto the horse, and leaping up before her, he turned toward the north, to the palace of the Red Branch Knights. And as they rode on beneath the leafy trees, from every tree the birds sang out, for the spell of silence over the lonely moor was broken forever.